The Republicans have become the champions of hostility to immigrants. They have carefully cultivated a scapegoat. They have persuaded large numbers of Americans that their economic difficulties are somehow the fault of immigrants. Now, as a professional economist, I can tell you this is grotesque nonsense. The United States empire is about a century old. The British Empire collapsed in the early part of the 20th century. The American empire is collapsing in the early part of the 21st century.
Our discussion, I think our debate is about the short run. And sometimes my criticism of you, if I may, is that you give the impression that American empire is just collapsing. It's just going away. But someone from the global south, it's difficult for me to see that going away this soon.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say it, and you may be quite right.
What your thoughts are on China vis-a-vis the whole socialist vision, the socialist utopia, socialist ideal? How much do you give China on that front?
Okay.
Professor Wolff, welcome back to India and Global Left.
My pleasure. Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I want to start with some recent developments with the US economy. And if we could start with this ongoing feud, if you like, between the MAGA Republicans on the one hand and the tech bros within the Trump camp on the other hand, the debate regarding the H-1B visa. How do you look at this division? On one hand, the so-called tech bros are saying that the United States lack skilled labor and we want more import of skilled labor. And then the MAGA bank says that we don't want all of that. How do you read these developments?
The way to understand this is to understand American history. It's always that way. It's always the history that shows us the clue as to what's going on. And here the history that's relevant is mostly the history of the Republican Party. The Republican Party is a coalition, as the Democratic Party is, but different components. The key component of the Republican Party has always been the employer class. According to the U.S. Census, 3% of the American people are employers of one kind or another, and the other 97% are not. And the Republican Party has been the vehicle for the very small minority to be in power by controlling a major political party. But in order to do that, the employers have to give the money with which the party then gathers the votes. And in effect, the Democratic Party has become the same thing. It used to be a party that relied heavily on labor unions. It relied heavily on small businesses, well-paid workers, that kind of thing, excuse me. But after the Depression was gone in the 1930s, and in recent decades, the Democratic Party has become like the Republican Party. That is, major corporations, big ones, fund the Democratic Party like they do the Republican Party. And the job of the Democratic Party is to gather another group of votes. This way, the donor class, the employers, control American politics because they give money to the Republicans. You go out there and you get the patriotic people, the military people, the Christian fundamentalists, the people who don't want abortion, the people who like to have guns. That's the Republican mass. The Democrats, labor unions, working people, women, minorities that are oppressed, you gather them. And then the donor class looks back and lets these two parties fight it out. And as Mr. Steven Schwarzman, the head of BlackRock, said before this election, we don't care who wins. He's exactly right. There's no need to care. they can work with Mr. Trump and the Republicans, or they can work with Kamala Harris and the Democrats. And they always have for now so many years that no one can remember what it was like before. Okay, this means if you have a coalition, let's look now at the Republican coalition, there are always tensions, as all coalitions have them. There are always tensions. Why? Because there will be occasions, and you're pointing to one of them, when what the wealthy donors want is not what is good for the mass that the Republicans have gathered. So, in this election, over the last few years, the Republicans have become the champions of hostility to immigrants. They have carefully cultivated a scapegoat. They have persuaded large numbers of Americans that their economic difficulties, poor wages, less job security, higher inflation, more dependence on borrowing and credit, all of these things are somehow the fault of immigrants. Now, as a professional economist, I can tell you this is grotesque nonsense. The United States is a nation of 335 million people, big country, with a big, rich, developed economy. The number of undocumented immigrants, 10 to 12 million, according to the United States government. And who are they? They are among the poorest people in the country. The idea that the condition of 330 million people would be shaped in a major way by the poorest of the poor 10 to 12 million is ridiculous. So it takes a lot of effort, but the Republican Party put in a lot of effort. And that's part of why they won this election. Because Kamala Harris not only didn't go against that, but she provided the same argument, not so harsh, not so nasty, but basically anti-immigrant. She was afraid, her advisors told her, to do anything else. So you created a mass of people who don't want any immigrant. And remember, in the Republican Party, you are also appealing to racist people, people who really don't want anything that doesn't have a white skin, is negative for them. So anti-immigrant becomes a polite way to be anti-brown, anti-black. So they have that too. So they really get the support to demonize the immigrant because it's an acceptable way to articulate white supremacy. Okay, so that's their vote. Now comes the president, who doesn't pay that much attention, who realizes he's got to be with those people. That's the whole strategy. So he speaks against immigrants violently. You know, Mexicans are all rapists and crazy stuff, but it works. It makes him unusual. Our politicians usually are polite, you know, like Clinton or Bush. He's very carefully not polite. He has to show the mass of people that he's different. Well, they're used to Mr. Bush saying something against immigrants, but they don't believe it anymore because it didn't seem to mean anything. So Trump has to be different. He has to be more aggressive, more out there in his language, and he does that. He says, I'm against immigrants. He brings in a new immigration czar. He's already announced for his new government, who will be tough and tough and tough. Then he gets a phone call from one of his major donors. Oh, no, let me correct that. His major donor, Elon Musk. I have to make sure everybody knows. Elon Musk personally gave over $250 million to Mr. Trump for his campaign. Crystal clear to everyone. Without that, Mr. Trump would have lost. So this is his biggest donor. This
also
is
a lot of crypto donors.
Yes, but it's Elon Musk. Crypto altogether is not Elon Musk. So he can deny to the cryptos what he gives to Mr. And you're seeing that now. So Mr. Musk comes to him and says, wait a minute, I need for my Tesla, for my SpaceX, for my own crypto maneuvers, I'm doing all of that, I need to have large numbers of highly trained, highly educated, people that I can hire. Because I don't want to pay the kinds of salaries I would have to pay to native-born Americans. So you can be anti-immigrant, but that has to be the exception. That has to be unallowed. You're not going to bother me with that. And he can get Ramaswamy to come along also, because this is another example of somebody. And besides which, the two of them are what they're talking about. They were themselves people allowed to come in under varying circumstances with special exemptions.
Also, Sri Ramakrishnan.
Yes, there are many. Look, let me take a step back and tell you why what they're doing is so classically imperialist. If you want to hire an engineer here in the United States, you really have to pay for the whole education and development of that engineer. And that begins early in life, when you're a little child, that you are trained to take school very seriously. You are urged to not be intimidated by mathematics. Many parts of our culture don't work like that. So you need a special early education to make you open to a technical education when you go to high school, and then even more so in college, and then even more. Well, imagine a society that wouldn't have to make all the expenditures to get a person ready to be productive as a technical engineer. That's colonialism in the modern world. We want India to pay for that. We want Guatemala to pay for it.
Also, mostly Indian public state, the public sector training this.
We don't care. We don't. As long as we don't have to pay,
right.
You can pay privately, or you can have your government raise the taxes to run the program. We could care less. We don't pay. We get you, the productive worker. You can arrive when you're in your 20s, and then we get 25, 30 years of your output desperately needed by your own country, which paid the education and now doesn't get the fruits. Whereas we in the United States, we get the fruits, we don't have to pay for the education. That the Indians permitted this all these years, that's a problem you'll have to ask someone else.
There is one angle to that as well, because ever since there is liberalization of the global economy, unlike China in the global south, most countries in the global south couldn't become productive so much that they have a current account surplus. So they have to manage the current account deficits by capital inflow. Now, parts of that capital inflow is begging or making your country more conducive to foreign businesses and stuff, but it's always inadequate. FDI inflows is very hard to get by because you have to develop the whole global supply chain and investment in labor. The easier way is to get short-term capital flows, and part of that comes from remittance. The Indian government, to have a stability in the balance of payment, depends on remittance.
Right.
And then you send your publicly trained, educated class outside, from whom you can get a little bit of remittance that stabilizes your balance of payment.
I don't want to spend time on that. I'm still answering your earlier question, but let me warn you. If the mass anti-immigrant scapegoating in this country succeeds, if the battle, for example, Stephen Bannon is now championing no immigrants versus Elon Musk, who wants exemption, if the outcome is really a general exposure of that, and I'll have more to say about that in a minute, you're going to have a real problem in India.
Absolutely.
Because what you're going to get is much fewer remittances coming home, but what will come home are people who want jobs, and you don't have jobs for them. So you're going to be plunged into an economic crisis. No money that you counted on. Lots of people looking for work who have expectations. They've been living in Silicon Valley, in San Jose. They have a certain, and they're not going to be happy in Hyderabad with what they're going to get there. And it's even worse in Central America, and Latin America. They have Mexico, how is Mexico, which has the largest number of these immigrants, poor ones, how are they going to, they have no way to give these people work. They can't go back to the rural because there's no agriculture they can't compete with the United States. That's what NAFTA's for. So you have, and the United States is going to be producing on its border chaos, economic and political, because there are movements there that can take advantage of this, more the left than the right. Okay, so it's a total mess, and it's a crisis because Musk, says, I didn't give you $250 million to have you do something that damages my appetite. This is impossible. And the hidden message, without it, no one has to say it. You do this, not only will you not get my $250 million, but your enemy will. And then you're finished, which Mr. Trump knows. So but he dare not change his position. Now, he did yesterday. He said he was going to go with Musk.
I employ a lot of H-1B on my real estate sector.
Stupid. I mean, that's another. I mean, I cannot account for that. You deal with that the way you want. But he sounds like he's going to go with the Musk, which he kind of has to. But how he's going to manage the other one, my guess is this is going to be the first of a whole series of these struggles. And if you allow me the language, I'm a student of Marx and I'm a student of Hegel. And the number one concept of these folks was the concept of contradiction. And life is about contradiction, and successful living depends on navigating the contradiction. How do you handle? Now, we in America pretend to put our hands in front of our eyes, and so if we don't see the contradiction, we hope it's not there. But the contradictions of Mr. Trump are the greatest I've ever seen. And the reason is simple. He understood better than most politicians that he has to win the election. That's all he's already a billionaire, so he doesn't need to get more money, and he wants it, but he wants to win, and he will say anything. It doesn't. Now, other politicians are like that, but there are limits. He didn't have many limits, Mr. Trump. And so what he did was to say whatever this audience, he thought, would like to hear. He knew who he couldn't reach. Cannot reach the basic unionized working class. I mean, with some exceptions, but he cannot reach them. He'll make a few efforts, but he does understand those are not his people, and black people are not his people. Hispanic people, he's trying, that he may there. But that's because of religion. That's through the Catholic and Protestant fundamental, because the Latino community is more susceptible to that. But basically, he's caught in a contradiction, and he doesn't know what to do. And these contradictions are now going to come very quickly. I'll give you a couple more examples. He wants to have tariffs. But tariffs is already a contradiction because the entire history of the Republican Party has been the anti-tax party. For a century, that's all every election, we won't tax you, we won't raise you, we'll lower the taxes. What? We will lower it's endless. Well, a tariff, for those who may not be clear, is a tax. A tariff is simply the name of a particular tax, a tax imposed when an object produced outside the United States comes in to the United States. When it crosses the border, it is required to pay to the U.S. government a tax, which is called a tariff. Another word for it is an import duty. there is clear what it means. So when Mr. Trump, in both of his elections, said, I'm going to hit the Chinese with a tariff, it shows that he doesn't understand economics, not even on the most simple level. He actually thought, because he kept saying it, that the tariff would be paid by China. But it isn't. It's paid by an American importer. And what the American importer is almost always likely to do is to raise the final price of the object in order to recover at least part of the duty paid to Uncle Sam. So it's a tax. And because it is so big, and because it is against Mr. Trump, Mexico and Canada, the two major trading partners of the United States, and China, the biggest power other than the United States in the world today, economically speaking, nobody else is close. This is a massive program of taxation. And one of the effects it'll have is to worsen the inflation in the United States. But it is opposition to inflation that enabled Mr. Trump to win the election. He was able to blame Biden and, by definition, Kamala Harris for the inflation. So how is he going to manage the contradiction between being the champion of higher tariffs on the one hand and the opponent and enemy of inflation? Can't be done. Cannot be. So the question is, how is he going to resolve it? Just like it can't be done that you can get rid of all the immigrants without putting Tesla and the whole of the American apparatus. We have developed our high tech in California and elsewhere heavily reliant on an army of engineers and technicians that come from other parts of the world. Particularly Asia, but not only Asia, all over, with more and more development based on all of that. And when you think of the remittances and you think of what might happen to these countries if these people have to go back home because they either don't have the documents or, as has been threatened, they may be required to lose their jobs, in which case they can't stay here anyway. You know, even if they are citizens, how are they going to stay? They can't get the job for which they are trained. What are they going to do? Become greeters at Walmart? I mean, we can't find enough jobs for the people we have in this country. We have serious unemployment. We just announced 1 million people homeless in the country. You know, this supposedly rich country. So these are contradictions. And I could go on. If you want, I will go on. I'll give you other examples of these contradictions. This doesn't work. And the question is, how is he going to navigate if he goes one way or the other? For example, going with Elon Musk and Ramaswamy and the others to let HB1 come through. Okay, then he's resolved that contradiction. But he has split his own MAGA movement. He has disappointed millions of people who will now be telling each other he's another traitor, like Bush, like Clinton. He can't afford that. The minute he looks like them, he's finished. Because he was acceptable as a man who rapes women. He was convicted of that. As a man who has, 8 businesses that went bankrupt because he failed. All of the things people know about him were acceptable because he was something new and different. If he's not new and different, then these other things are going to come back to haunt him politically. This is impossible. And there's no sign, I look for these things, there's no sign of how he's going to get out of this. Just like there are no signs that the American economy is going to emerge from its current crisis, or that the American empire will do anything other than continue to disintegrate, which puts pressures on him that are greater than have been on any president for a century. The United States empire is about a century old. The British Empire collapsed in the early part of the 20th century. The American empire is collapsing in the early part of the 21st century. And this has to be, the contradictions emerging from that are staggering. They make this issue of the visas, yes or no for HB1 versus your average poor immigrant. That looks like a small story relative to the enormous story that's coming down. But it is similar in the sense that it's a contradiction that they don't even understand what their problem is most of the time. In this case, they actually they understand, oh yes, we can't be anti-immigrant, but we must be anti-immigrant, but we can't be. They get that little one. But the bigger one, they pretend it isn't there.
The Financial Times, I think it was yesterday, wrote a long kind of column on some of the possibilities of the trade war or a post-WTO based consensus world where tariffs come up again and maybe countries lapse into national economies and so on and so forth. And they laid out like 5 or 4 possibilities, but effectively these were 2. And I wanted to have your thoughts on them. One of the possibilities they discussed was that the United States would fail in this trade war. China and others would integrate even more strongly. Even the European Union would look for Chinese electric vehicles and other ways to build stronger relations. Recently, I read about Nigeria and Chinese currency swap of about $2 billion, which means that some kind of bilateral agreement helps them to trade even more strongly. There is much more Chinese engagement in Central America and Latin America. And the United States, facing the brunt of inflation because of what you just described, would slow down even more. So that's one kind of possibility. The other possibility, they said, is when where the United States is successful, and that goes like this. It says that China faces slowdown, unable to export and continue its export-led strategy, and it's being unable to sort of retransition into domestic-led growth, and the United States being able to drive up its capital market, meaning to suck in all the capital back and to make a Silicon Valley-based high-tech-led growth model, which might be devastating for its working class, but it would keep the American hegemony floating. What's your impression of the other model, given you have been speaking for a while about the collapse of the American imperialism?
Well, I think the other one, let me take a step back. Again, the history. The Financial Times, The Economist, the Wall Street Journal, all the major places people go for, let's call it global economic analysis. They have a problem. They have inherited a problem, which is their own fault. They have assumed that the dominance of the United States that was real in the 20th century, certainly after the First World War, even more certainly after the Great Depression, and completely certain after World War II. So starting 1945 latest, you have had more than half a century of absolute dominance by the United States. Dominance militarily, economically, politically, ideologically, extraordinary. Culminating in the implosion of the Soviet Union, 1989, and the end of Eastern Europe and all of that. This has led to an inability to recognize the limits, because when they thought there might be limits, they weren't. The Soviet Union had an atomic bomb shortly after the end of World War II. In other words, they answered Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But they were never a threat to the United States. It was silly. And they thought it was. They were so horrified that another country could have nuclear weapons, especially one that was hostile. And then they learned, over the whole period of the second half of the 20th century, that the Soviet Union was not a major problem. It did not inhibit or block the dominance of the United States. They said so to justify the military, but nobody was fooled. And if you're an economist, it made no sense at all.
Right.
All right. You know, I try to teach people who don't know it that, you know, the GDP of Russia today, which is bigger than what it was under the Soviet Union, is, I don't know, $3 trillion, maybe
Maybe
four.
even less. Maybe even
Or
less.
less. 2.5.
Yeah.
And that of the United States is, I don't know, 28, 29 trillion dollars. So what are you talking? What? This is silly. There's no threat here. They have weapons. I get that. They have weapons, but they don't. Everybody knows that your ability to wield a military depends on your economy. And stop. What is this? And so then you had an arms race, which was the way to show the world and Russia, you can't keep up with us. Mm-hmm. We're spending, you know, the expenditures on military by the United States are equal to the next 10 countries, which include Russia and China, you know, and the rest are all allies of the United States anyway. So this is childish. And you can understand how you would get the notion that this is a level of dominance. You know, I don't even mention 750 military bases around the world, ringing Russia, ringing China. I mean, the Seventh Fleet is over there. There's no Chinese fleet here. I mean, unless you're crazy and living in the bubble of American anti-communism, in there, they're frightened of that. That's important. But anybody else, you know. I remember many years ago, there was a foreign minister in India named Krishna Menon.
Yeah.
Brilliant man. And it was the first time I understood how it looks from there. Mm-hmm. The guy they have now is very impressive too.
Jaishankar.
Yeah, he's very good. And he's not quick to be intimidated. The press goes after him, he comes right back. Very good. Anyway, unusual. The Indians, there weren't that many willing to do that. So in this period of dominance of the United States, here's the problem. You don't see as it begins to shrink, as it begins to crumble. You just don't see it. And I'll give you an example. All those things, when 10 years ago, for the first time, we heard the word BRICS, mm-hmm. Right? They made fun of it. Oh, look at these. Big mistake. Even now, they don't take it seriously. It's 9 countries, 9 partners, 4 more countries about to become partners, and at least a dozen more waiting. What are you talking about? This is half the population of the planet. The United States has 4.5% of the world's people. You can't pretend that this is not a difference here. So my answer to the 2 stories you laid out mm-hmm. is too late. This is a story, this is not about what can happen. This is about teaching their audience that we're in trouble. We have 2 ways we can go. This is the one that it looks like, but this is the one we can hope for. The second one is pure hope. It's not really, it could go. The whole thrust of the world now is BRICS, mm-hmm. not the United States. Let me give you just a simple example, which they will almost never talk about. I won't bore you with how many times, because I read all these things every day, as I guess you do. So I read these things. Here's what I read. The United States has the fastest growing economy in the developed world. That's not true. Why are you putting that in your newspaper? The International Monetary Fund, which is a Western organization, keeps track of economic growth. The economic growth of 2024, of which there are only 2 days left, right? So we know what it'll be. United States, 2.8% growth GDP. Every other member of the G7, less than that.
Right.
Germany, 0 or negative recession. What is it in Russia, the enemy in Ukraine? 3.5%. So Russia is growing faster. Russia!
But Russia is not developed in their internal
How
view.
convenient. Then let's go to China. Is China developed? Also not.
Not in their view. It's
Yes,
not
yeah.
part of the developed nations.
China's development for the last 30
Right.
years. China this year, IMF, 4.8. That's
Right.
almost double.
Almost
India, 7%. That's what IMF says. Okay? So India, Russia, and China, the three major BRICS economies, are all growing much faster. What do you think? And by the way, that's not new for China. That's been true for 30 years. That's why the Chinese now have the second biggest economy in the world, which, depending on how you count, will become the biggest by the end of this decade. So, it's too late. It's clear what's going to happen. Let me finish. I don't think the United States has a future at this point. It's not a question of coming up with clever ideas of what might happen. If you ask me, is it possible, this second story? Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes, it's possible. But I only say that for the same reason that I will say nobody can predict the future. There are too many variables and there's too many uncertainties. So is it possible? Yes. But I don't think it's there to sketch a possible road. I think it's there as part of the slow and painful re-education of the American capitalist class that the empire is finished. And they have to come to terms with it.
If we could stay with this a little bit more, and I'm not sure I fully, I have the same view about the hegemony of American imperialism, and I completely understand where you are coming from. But I think I'm coming from a different side, which is where I'm very skeptical about writing off of the dominance, hegemony, despotism of the global north and empires, because empires do get replaced soon after another. And I'm not indicating that there are other empires coming up, which I don't think is the case. When I look at the US, and I'm not talking about how inclusive it is, what is American working class, but the dominance of the United States. I look at the major stock indices. In 1980, at the peak of the Keynesian Great American Golden Capitalism, the US had about 30% of the major stock indices. Today, it's 70%. These are all data taken from the business press, Bloomberg and Financial Times. You look at the big tech. Since 2009, after the stimulus and everything, a lot of money went into them. Yeah. They are not inclusive at all. But their share in the global capital market, the US outweighs others by 4 times. Yep. In the debt and equity, which forms the capital market, which is a $13 to $14 trillion market, 70% of the capital inflows comes into the United States. These are only some of the parameters I laid out about the continued dominance of the United States economy. Over the rest, I'm not thinking about the Europe and others. They are really facing recessions, and they don't dominate. Yeah. Then there's the military component, which, as you admitted, it's absolutely trivial to talk about any other resistance. I mean, yes, Russia has weapons, China has some technology, but the US is by far, there is no one else there. And then we can think about the cultural terms, right? I've been to China, I study China, it's part of my research. We will discuss some of that, but China's ability to influence the rest of the world on cultural terms is way, way more limited than the United States. Yes. So respond to this. And my final comment would be on the BRICS itself, and we can discuss that separately. I like to see a multipolar world, but the excitement about BRICS, which I am politically, when I look at the reality, sometimes I find a juvenile excitement. And that's because a lot of the BRICS indicator comes from China. Yeah. One of the statistics given out by, let's say, Jeffrey Sachs, someone whom I admire in some ways, not his shock therapy and other things. He says that in the 1990s, height of the unipolar world, or the beginning, the BRICS, the Z7 countries shared about 45% of global GDP. And today that is down to like 29%. Right. And the BRICS nation were about 18, 19%. That's up to like 35%.
More, 41.
Yeah. But the missing link here is if you take out China from that equation, the parameters are much more modest. And we can go sector by sector, like manufacturing and so on and so forth. What I am saying is that I, as your student, a student of your economic lectures, I fail to relate to the collapse of American imperialism, even though I desire the end of that empire. So teach me more.
Okay. London remained very important in the global economy, even to this day. Mm-hmm. But the British Empire is a joke. Mm-hmm. There is no British Empire. Every empire leaves a residue. I mean, if you go to Italy, Italy is a small corner of Europe, economically speaking. And yet there are things there, the Vatican, the feudal remnants, the castles, the cuisine, the dress. They have held on, as most empires have, to something. The French have nothing except the residue of an... I love, my father is French.
I know.
You know, I speak French. I mean, but I can assure you, I love French. I go there every chance I get. But look, you know, it's a game. Mr. Macron is a joke as a leader. Even the French understand that. He has the popularity, I don't know, 12% of the polls. Yeah, and he just got defeated in 2 elections in a row. He can't give up. There's a politics, there's a revelation. You hold on. You're wearing jeans. That's soft power of the United States. The whole world learned that this really nothing but America. It was exported in the second half of the 20th century. Before that, it was a small pants company in California. It will be, my guess is long after the American empire is in memory, jeans will exist. Mm-hmm. They are the residue. The United States has this incredible nuclear arsenal. What good is it? They can't use it. They had an they understood, reasoning like you do, or like you just said you do. They took one look at the Russians when they crossed the border and invaded Ukraine in February of 2022. They looked at the situation and they smiled. Mr. Blinken, Mr. Sullivan, the neocons have been waiting for a chance to get Russia for 30 years. For them, the Cold War never ended. Mm-hmm. For them, because they live in the world of an empire dominating. They never lived in the world of communism, socialism, Marxism, about which they know nothing. That's my generation. Uh-huh. These are I went to the same schools they did. I understand them really well. I have friends like that I know really well. They don't know anything about it. They were proud never to study Marxism, never to read it, never to think about it, not to work. They were leaders of the big power in the world. And they were clear that they could and they would win in the Ukraine. They're defeated. They're completely defeated. They even know it. Yesterday's New York Times has a story about the end. It's over. Even the New York Times, which is desperately their newspaper, not mine. But it's so grotesque. They didn't understand BRICS. They didn't understand what it means that Russia can go and sell oil and gas to India and China. They didn't get it. Why not? That's not a brilliant inference. If you know something about the BRICS, if you know something about the energy needs that China and India have, and that Russia is the great export, I mean, how complicated was this? So these are smart people. I mean, these are intelligent folks. Why'd they miss this? They missed it because they're living in the 20th century. They're living with the dominance that they are committed to preserve. They say that all the time. They are determined to preserve. I don't doubt them. They are.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yep.
But they can't. They can't. And why can't they? Because there are too many contradictions that they can't navigate anymore. They didn't have to in the later 20th century, because it was the story you told. We are the center. We are the dominant. Are there ways in which they still are? Yes. An empire doesn't fall apart neatly across the board in all dimensions. It's like when someone says we have a 4% inflation. Yes, but eggs went up by 200% and gasoline only by 3%. It's on and on. An inflation is a general... everything has its own pace, or if you use Marxism, it's an unevenly developing society. And the empire is as uneven a development as anything else is. So I expect to see areas that we haven't even seen yet where the United States may become dominant. One of those that, for example, that many of us missed was fracking. We didn't understand what the fracking phenomena could do to the United States, switching it from net importer to net exporter of oil and gas. So, all right, we have to, that very important to the empire, ability to survive. But you are watching, I mean, I don't want to throw counterexamples at yours. And
no, please throw counterexamples, because that will lead to more.
Then that's all we're doing. You're giving...
Right.
Okay, I'll do that, but I expect that there will be areas where the United States holds on to its empire. You know, maybe what happened in Syria recently is an ability of the United States to have a stronger position in that part of the world than it had before. Maybe the Israeli horror is strengthening something. But I can show you about both of those that there may be ways it's strengthening, but there are ways in which the empire is done. When you have vote after vote in the United Nations of 150 countries against 2, U.S. and Israel, the handwriting is on the wall. You can pretend, and you may be right, it may take 30 years for this to play out. Look, my parents were refugees from Nazism in Europe. That's why I speak French and German. My mother German, my father French. Part of what you're watching in Gaza is the repayment by those people of what they suffered, because it's not them, their parents, their grandparents suffered. You know that from you know people who are Muslim and who are Hindu and who went through the partition and all of that, and it's still in their heads. Mr. Modi's whole political career is wrapped up in that issue from which he will never escape, whatever you think about him. All right, counterexamples. Most of the governments in Europe are what we would nowadays call center-right governments. They supported the United States in their own area, Europe, right? Ukraine is part of Europe, not part of any other place. It's Europe. In Europe, they followed the United States and spent a fortune of money, which they cannot afford, to throw endless junk into a dead hole of Ukraine, all of which is gone now, okay? Why did they do that? Their people don't support them. The polling in Europe is crystal clear. They do not support it. Now Mr. Trump is threatening, because of the difficulties in this country,
to make them pay.
That's right. They can't pay. Where are they going to get it from? They can't pay. And they are now confronted with the deal they made, which can't be sustained. Now, you could answer me by saying, well, Mr. Trump may let that go, like he lets other things go, like he may have to let go the export or deporting of the immigrants. Yeah, he may. I mean, who can account for what that guy does? On the other hand, the basic problem doesn't go away. Europe made a deal, like in the story of Faust, Mephistopheles, and here's the deal. You protect us, you Americans, military, against, let's call it Russia and communism, but it's against our own working class. And here's how that's going to work. We don't have any defense expenditures, and not very much. You're going to take care of that. You want to, because you're going to do a Keynesian game. That's what you're good at. And you're going to do it through the military. You're gonna pump your economy. By the way, those have been going on and off for, I don't know, a matter. So here's the deal. We will have enough money that we can subsidize our capitalists to compete with you, and we can give social welfare in a way that nobody else in the world can do. We will give our workers medical care, free education, my family, my French family, 5 weeks off paid vacation every year. All my family gets that. That's when I visit them. That's how I can go. And we will have enough money to do that. And we'll keep our economies going. We know we can't do like you, but you're going to help us subsidize our own capitalists. Okay, that's how it worked. The United States got the ability to spend amounts of money on the military that are silly, and to do it year in and year out, and to even sell to the American people that by doing this, we make sure to have war over there, not here. So it's good for us. We are saving ourselves. Unbelievable. But when the wind is blowing in your direction, you can avoid your contradictions. You can paper them over. You can make solutions because you don't deal with them. But that means you haven't dealt with them. And one day, and we're at that day now, it won't be possible anymore. And now the Europeans are in an impossible situation. They can't develop their own military. That's why they're not doing it. Where's the money going to come from? They can't. If they try to do away with their social welfare, they will. Look at France. The largest bloc in the French parliament now is Monsieur Mélenchon. I don't know if you follow French politics. He's a Marxist and has been all his life. How is this possible? How did they, the French, who can't unify about anything, I'm half French, they all got together, the socialists, the communists, the Greens, and Monsieur Mélenchon, and together they're the majority. They're the largest plurality, but on their way to a majority. This is as nothing as what you're going to see in the rest of Europe. I mean, they may come up with a temporary solution, but what you're watching is it's unraveling on them. And you can tell me, well, but they could do this, or well, yeah. Look, the war in Ukraine helped the right wing tell the story. We have to protect against the Russians, and to develop a dominance in Finland and in Sweden. Okay, I get it. Is that a strengthening of NATO? Yes. Is NATO stronger? No. Stop. The whole point of NATO, the United States keeps telling the Europeans, we're moving to China. Our focus is China. What does that tell the Europeans? If our focus is China, and you're in a deep trouble in your country, we're not going to help you. We don't care about you. We don't even care if half of you go over and join the BRICS. Mr. Macron is rumored to have requested BRICS membership for France and to have been turned down for it. I mean, these are signs. I don't know if that rumor is true, but these are signs that I would argue are crystal clear. 2 days ago, I believe, was the first shipment, may have been a week ago, of a brand new port built on the Pacific side of the Pacific Ocean in Peru. Mm-hmm. It's the biggest, most modern seaport, I believe, in Latin America, possibly in the whole Western Hemisphere. I don't know. Built with Chinese money and engineers, but it's a deal between China and Peru. And what does it permit? The whole southern half of Latin America, that is Peru, Chile, Argentina, all huge economies, those three, particularly Chile and Argentina above all, they don't need the United States. They don't need the Panama Canal. They now have a magnificent artery, goes directly from Peru, will be their export hub, to China, which will be buying everything and shipping everything back with an enormous subsidy because it's a much shorter ride. No fees in the canal, nothing. And this is happening every day. These are not good things for the United States. Will the United States still be writing the insurance for the voyage of the grain from Argentina to China? Yes.
The insurance companies would profit.
Will be an American company. That's right. But over time, because if the British are any model, over time, a Chinese bank will come in and rescue one of those insurance companies or buy it out or start with a small interest. Let me give you another example. The United States slaps 100% tariff. Mr. Biden did this. 100% tariff on electric vehicles from China. In France, if you go to France today and you go on the highway, you will see BYD, the Chinese company, its automobiles, electric car all over the road. Trucks, cars, buses, everything. You go to the United States, not one. No, go look, you won't see a thing. Okay, we have 100% tariff. Okay, now let's follow the logic. I'm going to be an economist for a moment. Here's the logic. Every American company that needs to buy cars or trucks as inputs to its business would like to buy an electric car and an electric truck for 25 reasons. It can't buy the BYD. Why? Because the BYD costs the price of the car plus 100%, doubling the price of the car of the tariff that goes to Uncle Sam. So if, let's say, simply, the car or the truck costs $30,000 freight on board, $30,000 at the port of entry anywhere else. Here in the United States, you would have to pay $60,000. You'd have to give $30,000 to get it to be shipped, and another $30,000 at the port to Uncle Sam to have it released so you can get it. So no American company is buying BYD electric cars and trucks. What about the quality of electric cars and trucks, BYD? Universally agreed, by far the best quality and the lowest price. In other words, if you look at the last 10 or 15 years of competition to produce electric cars, it's clear who won and who lost that competition for whatever reasons, The Chinese won. They wanted to, and they did. And so they're in. And they're selling those cars all over the world in huge numbers. Asia, Africa, Latin America, Europe. Europe has a tariff, by the way, but they can't afford to do what the Americans do, so their tariff is about 30-40%, not 100%, and that's enough of a difference that the Chinese can make a money. Okay, now let's follow the logic. Every competitor of the United States producing anything, anywhere in the world, is going to now have an advantage that the American doesn't have. He can get cheaper, better vehicles than the American. Why? Because the American, when he buys an electric vehicle, will have to buy a Tesla or a Ford or a General Motors, paying almost what it would cost to get the BYD. They can charge $55,000 because still $5,000 less than the BYD. So they're going to get an inferior product, right? And pay way much more for it. You can't do this. You can do it once. You can do it with one dimension of your product, but you can't. And this is being replicated over. And if there are more tariffs, it'll be even worse than it already is. And the electric car is not a minor matter in world trade. Look at what cars have been in the history of Japan or the United States. I mean, they're crucial to the modern device. So they're going to be crucial in the future. So these are signs. They're not finished yet. We're only at the early stages. There will be American efforts to copy. They're already going on. BYD, both its methods and its technology and all the rest. But it's happening too often, and there's very little the other way.
I think
By the way, a footnote, the money coming into New York, that's their money. I mean, it's still the place to play. It's the center of the global capital market. No question. Probably will be for a while. But the rationalizations, the strategic interventions are coming from around the rest of the world, more and more.
But that's where the domination of global capitalism lies. I mean, if our analysis is that global capitalism's dominance lies in manufacturing, then we will reach to that line of argument following total devastation of the U.S. manufacturing, except perhaps the defense industry, to following a logical conclusion, we would say, look, here is the massive decline of the U.S. hegemony. But if our analysis moves on from the manufacturing giants, the monopolies as they created at the time when Paul Baran or Sweezy were writing about monopoly capital. And I think that's sort of my criticism about those who rely too much on Baran and Sweezy's analysis. I don't fault them because they were writing in the 1960s.
Right.
They didn't see the rise of the tech finance sector, which now dominates it. So it's the dominance of the BlackRocks, the asset manager, the Citadel LLCs, the Royal Asset Management in the UK. One can go on and on. That's where the money is coming to. If you look at, a lot of people talk about the military dominance of the US, with the top US expenditure outstripping the next 10. I looked up the Fortune's 500 companies, and you would be surprised, and you would not be because you know this, but a lot of people would be surprised that the dominance in the financial sector is even more than the dominance in the military sector. If you list them, there are some Chinese banks, the agriculture banks, the construction banks, but those are also public sector banks, which doesn't operate with the aim of dominating the world as such. There was a recent conference in Singapore of investors, and there was this question, a show of hands about, is there, and this was one of the massive investment gathering of investors. And the question was, is there anyone who doesn't have one financial asset on dollar terms in the Wall Street in New York? And there was none, which means that dollar continues, and we can discuss a little bit about the de-dollarization and falling apart of the dollar. Dollar continues to be the last haven of investor sentiment.
Absolutely.
So if there is any form of uncertainty, it's not just the raising of interest rates in the United States that pulls back money from the global south. But if there is any uncertainty in the global south where rate of return might be higher in usual terms, they would just switch back because they think that the private property in this place would be protected like nowhere else. So it's the safest haven. We talk about these banks and black money when we talk about safe havens, but in my assessment, the safest haven for private capital and capitalism is the United States capital markets. And as long as that sentiment continues, money keeps flowing here. And you can dominate the electric vehicle market, you can dominate agricultural production sometimes, and you can dominate these lower layers of capitalism, but they don't care. And that's what separates, in my assessment, Britain in 1914 and 1915, where it had already lost out to Germany and the United States in the industrial domain, but it was also slowly losing out in the financial domain. And the United States, which in my assessment has long lost the industrial game to other rivals, the East Asian rivals, the Nick economies, even France and Germans and then Chinese.
Right.
But in my assessment has not lost the financial battle. And that's where I think anyone who quickly writes off the American imperialism, and it must be clear to you, I'm coming from a very different prism. I'm not among those who thinks that American empire is good. It has to go. And it will go in the long run. Our discussion, I think our debate is about the short run. And sometimes my criticism of you, if I may, is that you give the impression that American empire is just collapsing. It's just going away. But someone from the global south, it's difficult for me to see that going away this soon.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say it, and you may be quite right. As I think about it, I've lived here all my life. I was born in the United States. I've worked here all my life. I've been taught the lesson over and over again how dominant the United States is. Mm-hmm. And the last 10 years, I did not imagine that I would live to see. So I am partly affected, no doubt, by observing decline, breakdown, difficulty that I never saw admitted. I still see much that is going on that is not admitted. And I'm still rethinking a little bit with chagrin that I didn't see these things before. But that's how this kind of process works. You didn't see it before. It takes the next step, then you revalue your past in the light of the changes of the present. So you and I may not, I don't know, we'll see how far apart we are. I have no dispute about the dominance of finance, but I would also argue that I have now been called in quite a few times to hedge funds based here in New York who tell me straightforward, we have lots of people we count on to advise us, but we don't normally talk to people like you. And we realize we should. We need to factor into our strategic planning what the perspective you bring. Mm-hmm. So they're not doing me any favor. They realize that the empire, translation, the empire is perhaps not what we assumed it would be. And those are the questions they ask. When I finish my little spiel, which they asked me to do, then the questions are all about that. And I would...
It might be also...
Let me finish. I would argue, you might talk to the head of BlackRock or Blackstone or any of them, and you might be surprised at the disconnect in their minds between their being an American, because that's what they are, and the logic of their investment portfolio, which is now explicitly taking into account, in many cases, the decline of the American empire, which they talk about. Publicly, no, that's unwise to do. But do they? Yeah. Oh, yeah. How many, what proportion? There's no way for me to know that. But are they there at the very top of the pile of those people? They have to be. They're crystal clear that the war in Ukraine was lost. They knew that a year ago. A year ago. Only in this country are there still significant numbers of people who haven't figured that out yet. And those have to be now managed because they're a liability politically. I think you have to be very careful, though. It's not just that, manufacturing has gone, but with it have gone all kinds of assumptions, all kinds of notions, for example, of what it means to really have a developed infrastructure. What does it mean to have a telephone system, a train system? You need all of that. And how are you going to do that? And where do you even locate the friggin' harbor or the rail line? These have become strategic questions that have to be analyzed. You have to have a 30, 40-year horizon. You don't want to put the railroad when it goes to a place from which the ships will not be going. Well, you've wasted your whole thing, I wrote a doctoral dissertation about Kenya in East Africa. And I remember studying why the British built the one line of railway from the port, Mombasa, in the port, into the interior. Well, it's because they export the coffee. That's what the Kikuyu, if you know Kenya a little bit, the Kikuyu highlands is where they made the reservations. They forced the Africans, made them effectively slaves, brought the British colonial in to set up the coffee plantations. But you would never build a railroad like that again. Why? Because they built for the empire because Britain wanted coffee. Britain wanted to play the role in the world of coffee that they already had with tea. Mm-hmm. So, that's what Kenya became, just like Uganda becomes cotton. Right. And stuff like that. This is what they did. And that's happening now. Blackstone is facilitating the development of infrastructure in Kenya and Tanzania, whose intention is to be providers to China. And the Chinese are building the railroads that the Blackstone is financing. What Blackstone is doing, which I believe they know, is they're going where the profitable, their job is to make money over the 5 or 10 year horizon. That's what they're doing. And if that means building the mechanisms that in the long run will come back and bite them, they give you the same answer that Keynes gave. In the long run, we are all dead. So we cannot gamble on that. But you're gambling with what you're doing. Then they look at you. They have no answer for that. Because they've accomplished what you and I are arguing about. They know. I hope I'm not giving them more than they deserve. I really wouldn't want to do that. But they may understand the situation they're in and not want to face it. You can say, because of where you're coming from, in the long run, it's all they can't do that. They can't do that. They have to devalue the long run if it looks like that. So it becomes it's dead. It's dead. And so they're going to make, and the possibility that what they're doing is financing their own demise, this is not, they won't go there.
Yeah.
Even after, and I mean this, even after 3 martinis in the same meal, they won't go there.
I wanted to ask you, as you spoke about the nervousness within the business class,
yes.
And I wanted to follow up a question since it's so real. You get that impression when every time you read the Bloombergs and the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal. But also when you read Marx's understanding of the horizontal instability because of competition within the business class. So right. He spoke of at least 2 contradictions. One was the vertical between the working class and the owners of capital, and there was a horizontal
competition between the business class because they wanted to outcompete each other in terms of prices, in terms of inventing new technology. I'm repeating things that you are the master in for our audience, and that Marx called a relative surplus. I wonder if some of those nervousness, which you spoke of and which I see all the time, is not necessarily because they feel that a grand apparatus is collapsing, rather because they are competing within their own rivals and they have to sustain within that unstable market. And why I'm asking this is because, again, coming from that idea of monopoly capital where things are relatively more stable, there are no rivals, and that leads to stagnancy and fall in aggregate demand and all that theory. I think that's a wrong line of saying, because when I read the business press, I see a lot of instability. Citadel LLC is thinking about retaining its monopoly data that it created after the stimulus of following the global financial crisis, where it picked up easy money and invested them to gather data, and now they have become the masters of quoting fair prices to brokers in the capital market, and that gives them their small little empire, and they want to protect their empire, not necessarily the empire that we were talking about. So what I'm saying essentially is, yes, there are lots of nervousness and there's a lot of competition, and there are different segments within the business, and within the business class, it's not a uniform class, it's not a unified class. Right. The creditors and the debtors sometimes talk in very different language in terms of where the interest rate should be. Right. So my question to you is some of that nervousness, is it inbuilt within capitalism? And why that is important, I feel, is to not underestimate the strength of capitalism, which many Marxists, including, I feel, to some extent, Marx as well, did. I don't fault Marx as much, because when he was writing, capitalism was not as strong as when, let's say, Gramsci was writing, or when what we are seeing. But a lot of Marxists of the classical variety would also write of capitalism rather quickly. My final comment for you to respond to everything is that I must also admit I was born after the 1990s, so I was part of a relatively pessimistic world in terms of the left, where we are much more defensive and we don't see revolutions in the air, and so maybe it's my inability to see about or envisage a post-capitalist world. But my basic point here is that all this nervousness within the business class, the instability, one galloping another, business class going bankrupt all the time, the quibbles about the interest rates, these are inbuilt mechanisms of capital, and then they don't imply at all the overall collapse of the capitalist empire.
Okay. Well, you're quite right. It is my engagement with the Marxist tradition, which has been very important in my education, despite my participation in the elite universities of this country, where the effort was made to remove all of that kind of thinking. But fortunately, it was made by people who didn't understand it in the first place. So their skill at making you not believe it was poor, because they didn't know what they were doing. That's the Cold War. And the consequences of that for the United States run very deep, but that's another conversation. If you engage the Marxist tradition the way I did, particularly focusing on Das Kapital and the economic analytics, then you would always expect to find within the capitalist class enormous uncertainty, competition, anxiety of one kind or another. And it would take a variety of forms. It would sometimes be focused on the competition horizontal among producers of the same or more or less the same commodity. The fear of what you rightly referred to, but I won't go into because it'll take a while, a relative surplus value, the ability of a competitor to be able to sell the same product at a lower value than you can do, and thereby steal your customers, and you are finished. It's that kind of worry. And that means worried about new technology, worried about installing it, worried about where you even find out about it. All of those things are very real, and they impose themselves on every capital. He has to. If he's not nervous and he's not understanding, and that means he won't be there very long, because it's also a training capitalism for the capitalists how to function. Then there's a whole other kind of anxiety, which is also present, which is the tense relationship between you and the employees that you hire, whose attitudes, whose work ethics, whose productivity, however you measure it, are a constant source of anxiety because they become a competitive value relative to others who might be having a different experience. So you're constantly looking for how to deal with all of the real, and they're not just real now, but they're potential real issues. You know, we've been talking earlier about immigration. Immigration's always can I take advantage of an immigrant? And the reason migration happens, if you ever studied it, is not just the push that makes a person leave where they come from, but the pull of where they're going to. And there better be a pull, and if there isn't what is that pull? And the pull has always been, in large measure, that you can rip off the immigrant in a way you cannot the domestic
citizens.
Now, it's not always true, but it's a good rule, and certainly been the case here in the United States. So I expect the capitalists to be full of anxiety about a whole host of these kinds of problems. I think in the United States, the difference is that on top of those, which capitalists have learned to try to navigate, even, for example, and this is where I had an early disagreement with Sweezy and Magdorf and Baran, who were my teachers. I don't find in Marxian argument, in Marxian theory, a tendency from competitive to monopoly.
Right.
Or let me put it differently. I see that, but I see the reverse as well.
Exactly.
So for me, I'm expecting at any moment to be able to identify, or I should be able to identify, movement that would be described as competition evolving into monopoly, and simultaneously elsewhere the reverse.
So part of the Schumpeterian argument of regeneration through destruction of even unproductive units.
Yes, similar to that.
Right.
That's right. But the movement is in both directions.
Right, absolutely.
And I would expect to find massive efforts by those who have achieved the monopoly to hold on to it. I would expect to find similar strategies that got them to a monopoly and similar vulnerability for the monopoly to be undone. And that they learn that a monopoly that isn't actively protected is doomed. And therefore the anxiety of the monopolist is different, but is not greater or lesser than the anxiety of the competitor. Okay, so I approach it with that. But when I talk about the decline of the empire, I'm talking about positions achieved in the 20th century that are leaving the scene in the 21st. They are the kind of anxiety that you might, I'll pick an example. When transportation in the United States, at the end of the 18th century and in the early part of most of the 19th century, when transportation was with a horse and a carriage, there was lots of competition among the people who made the carriages, made the wheels, built the roads, there had lots of that. And the railroads came in at a certain point. But the automobile, there was a qualitative change.
Right.
You might even play with the old Marxian quantity quality, that there's a quantitative struggle. Can I lower the unit value of output and defeat my competitor that way? But if you keep doing that, it's like lowering the temperature of the water. At a certain point, it becomes a solid, it's no longer a liquid.
Right.
At a certain point, you don't have an anxiety of competition. You have an anxiety that your business is historically finished. You can will there be some people who produce horse carriages? Absolutely. Did some of them survive? Yes, they did. But that industry was finished. And most of the people involved in it eventually, like in the textbook, found new jobs in the automobile. Usually one that could take a skill that had been relative and adapt it to which becomes kind of the pattern. And so my argument about the anxiety of the business community now is an anxiety that is caused by the declining empire and heavily influenced, not only. Capitalists are constantly navigating, if I can use the language, between those things they have to be anxious about that are the old competitive and those things that are new. And they're often skeptical, not like you are. How big a difference is this? Well, often it isn't. It's a mirage, you can survive. But other times you can't. You're seeing that, interestingly, in our culture now, in a number of places. There are, retail stores that used to be very successful businesses. Loads of them.
Right.
They're finished. They're dead. They're gone.
More so in the United States. That's something, it always strikes me when I come to the US as opposed to, of course, where I come from in India. But even comparing with places like London, whose streets are always much more full of small little retail stores, as opposed to New York is perhaps slightly different, but you go to a place like Chicago, it's so corporatized, it's full of those supermarkets and shopping malls.
And the whole country is.
Right.
For example, we have a vast wasteland of malls, these special places that were built so that the businesses could cluster. They're dead. They're
Today there is a Bloomberg article desperately trying to say, look, the commercial real estate sector has been written off for a while, but look how they're reviving and how Amazons and others now have realized that we need a brick and mortar warehouses, and so they are coming back, and houses have not been built as much, so prices are going up, and so on and so forth. But anyway, sorry for that.
No. I would describe that differently, but well, maybe it's worth it. Amazon, UPS, the whole apparatus of you're not going to the store, you're not going to the thing, because you can so very conveniently order it
online.
So you go online and you pick your jacket and it comes in a package. And so we have developed, because of the craziness of capitalism, we have wasted a vast industry, retail. And remember, retail, particularly big retail, is based on credit, which means that an enormous amount of bank credit is in the hands that can never be paid back. Those people they will never pay it back. Because of the leases being often 10 years, it'll take time before the bank has to declare that we are bankrupt. So you can delay the bank crisis But if you study the banking system in the United States, it's very worried, above all, about commercial real estate right now, because they know
Absolutely.
there's a tsunami coming,
Right.
and how it comes and when it comes. Okay, but this is
Also, they're very nervous about the necessity to raise interest rates because a lot of their assets is through lending to these sectors. When you raise the interest rates, those businesses go bankrupt, and so your bank goes essentially bankrupt. But you also have to control inflation because that's the mandate, or also to disempower the laboring class.
You're making my argument. You have an accumulation of country. I'm not looking. I don't expect the empire to fall. Poosh, donk. Even if you take an example like that, the 1989 Russia, that's an accumulation. Russia didn't have something bizarre happen in the late 1980s. But if you put together the arms race they couldn't afford, and taking over in Afghanistan, which they couldn't afford, and you do, it was too much. They couldn't. They had promised their own working class a rising standard of living. They had delivered it to them for the period 1970 to 1985. That's 15 years. It's a whole new generation who had the right nice clothing and nice stores in Moscow and Leningrad and blah, blah, blah. You couldn't do it. It's what's happening in Europe. They can't sustain their social welfare system, and they can't take it away. And they don't know what to do. And the United States, far from helping them, is saying, fuck you, you're on your own,
Spend more on military now.
Yes, spend the one thing for sure they can't do. I mean, anyway, so I want to go back to the United States. Why did I pick the mall? Because here's the way I see the story. You destroy the physical mall because you can do something that the merchant did for the manufacturer better than the merchant can. Think of I don't know if you've ever studied Volume 3 of Capital, but Marx does this there for us. So one of the great benefits of my colleagues in the United States is having never opened that book and read it, they have no idea how to think like this. Anyway, Marx, very clever there. So the capitalist produces a product, this water, this cup, right? And now when the production is done, the capitalist has to convert it back into money. And that costs, the capitalist could hire a salesman or a saleswoman and get them a computer to keep track and put them in a car, and they can travel to all the different places which sell it. And that costs them money.
Right.
That's a deduction of the surplus used to accomplish something that is not productive, namely the conversion of one form of value, the cup, into another, the money. Okay. Along comes the merchant, the retailer, and
We'll
says,
facilitate this and lower the cost of this conversion.
That's right. You give me a discount of 2 cents per cup, I'll take care of it. I will have a truck pick up the cup from the back of your factory. You don't have to worry about it. I'll take it from there. It'll deliver to my store. I am building the store. People will come to the store and they will buy, among other things, your cup. And I will sell it at its value, $10. You will have given me 2 cents, $9.98. That's all I need. You were spending, let me show you, you were spending 18 cents on sales. Now you're going to be spending 2. Okay, now comes along Amazon. Goes to the manufacturer. You don't have to spend 2. Just give me 1. Undercuts the merchant.
Right.
Destroys them all.
And then raises.
And then raises the price. And when he does that, because he's got a monopoly on this game, he can squeeze both ends. That's the genius of it. He squeezes the manufacturer, but even if he can find even if he can't squeeze the manufacturer, he's busy looking for an alternative and then plays them against each other and gets the cheaper one, the one to give him the bigger. But the margins are becoming thinner and thinner. So what happens? In order to survive, Amazon has to what? Squeeze the shit out of its workers. Operate these, I don't know if you've ever been in one, I have, an Amazon distribution center, which is an enormous building with these trucks and the workers who are monitored. There are pill dispensers.
Right.
Have you ever been in there?
I've been in Indian Amazon.
Well, I'm sure you have the same. That's
Yeah, same.
Stupid of me. I should have
Right,
understood.
right.
No, you're right. Of course you do.
It's even worse there in terms of labor
but the
conditions.
pill, free. You can get aspirin, you can get, because they know you're going to, they're driving you to be sick.
Right.
And now they're giving you a quick, for free. For free. The workers told me with great excitement, for free. So guess what? It is becoming intolerable, not just for the workers, but
For small businesses.
no, if I get that, for the customers of Amazon itself, because there's too much publicity about the horrible. My wife will not order from Amazon.
Yeah, that's also happening in Europe and the
Yes.
US, but not in the global south. The global south, the consumers are mostly middle class and they are
Therefore,
noxiously disconnected from the working class, as the global south is even more unequal
Yes.
than the global north. And so Amazon has destroyed small businesses mainly.
yeah, that's what it did here.
It's horrible for the working class, but given so much of it is informal working class anyway, they do there. Sometimes they die, riding motorbikes because they have to deliver in time. Meanwhile, the consumer class is very happy because they have been getting better price points. In the global north, I see these anti-Amazon boycott movements. Yeah, more and more.
And you also have, more indirectly, but for me, I'm a Marxist, right? You have the working class. We have an upsurge in the labor movement in this country.
Absolutely.
And it's centered in places like Amazon, Starbucks, all of that. And so this is another problem. And it's causing great anxiety because there's a demand for higher wages everywhere.
Right.
Boeing, those workers rejected the contract twice. It's a whole new attitude. I'm called by unions. I haven't been for a long time. They want me to explain to you. Oh, boy, will I explain. But here's another one that's very important. Amazon can't deliver. It can't deliver partly because the workers are angry. And the workers, throw the package out the window. I mean, they're sabotage all the time. And the more they come down on their workers, refuse to recognize the union, the more. And guess what? That's the movement back. Macy's is trying to tell investors, the Macy's stock is in the floor. Kohl's, another one, in the floor. I mean, at 10-year lows in the stock market. Why? Their response. They're coming back. Well, the evidence for that is small, but a little. They're coming back. They don't want to say why. They're not coming back because you're good. They're coming back because they're horrified at what's happening over there. Too many stories. And it's not just the stories in the media. It's the story of your neighbor. It's the story of the nephew of your cousin who took 2 weeks in the hospital because he was so exhausted by what his job was over the Christmas season, helping to move shit. Wow.
Right.
The Canadian postal system is on strike, has been now for many weeks. That's part of that. They were pushing it, and so the whole Christmas season blew away. You can't mail anything.
Yes.
I gave a talk to the Canadian Auto Workers Union, right? 6 weeks ago. I still haven't got paid. I got a salary for, a payment for it because it can't get through the mail. I can't get paid from this. The union has paid me. It's not an issue, but I can't receive it because there's so these are new levels of anxiety. These are whole industrial anxiety. And then there is an anxiety about China. There are enough capitalists in the United States who have been threatened by or destroyed by the competition from China. You should see China as serious in that in that regard.
I think that's my next question, and that's why I'm stopping you. But before that, as you were speaking, I was also. I'm not sure if you are following this California bill about the minimum wage, which was raised from $16 per hour to $20 for hotel workers
Yes.
in the restaurant sector, which employs more than 60 employees. And Bloomberg covers it and says, their usual rant, oh, why just those who work in the restaurant sector? Why not this sector? And so this is a bad idea. Let's do this and that. Yes, but I think a good segue into this is to discuss a little bit on China, also to connect with your discussion on empire.
I'm a little lost, though. What's the link to the restaurant worker minimum wage?
No, but since you were talking about the center of discontentment and labor organization within this kind of gig works, which has been going on.
I just wanted to begin to elaborate the levels of anxiety. You know, your labor force, your competitor,
Right.
and now China, now larger social forces that you're upset about. But there are some intangibles that should be in this conversation. The level of social division and hostility inside the United States, I've never seen in my lifetime. And, you know, on my gray hair, I've been here a long time. Lived all my life in this country. This I have never seen before, not this level. And you're seeing the return of serious pathologies, white supremacy. We thought as a nation that had been settled. That probably was naive, probably was driven by wishful thinking.
You were also the product of the post-civil rights movement, the excitement of the civil rights movement,
among other things.
and the anti-Vietnam War.
Yeah, and then it became, you know, you couldn't say bad words, you couldn't be racist in public. It was considered, it reflected on you rather than whoever you were calling the name, you know? I mean, I don't know what the condition in India is with the Dalit people, but what that was, I haven't heard enough stories to know that. Has that changed? Well, we thought it had changed in this country. And we are confronted.
The Dalits in India most often cites the example of the civil rights movement as one of the positive things that happened, which never happened to the Dalits in India.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and that's how we saw it too.
Right.
That's right. We thought we had really overcome that. We didn't. We didn't. White supremacy is much stronger than most of us, I admit, me too, had understood. I will tell you that as a child in this country, growing up, remember my parents are European, white Europeans. So I didn't grow up except in that framework. I didn't speak English until I was 5 years old. I understood as a child. Once I could see in my community how white people lived and how black people lived, I understood the way you do without knowing you're understanding that this was horrible, that the treatment of these people, just beyond words. And it stayed with me all the way through. There were very, very, very few black students at Harvard, very few at Stanford, and then very few at Yale. And that no one said a word about it. No one noticed it. No one took account of it. I mean, a handful of the black kids were beginning to say something. But otherwise, it was routine. It was normal. Anyway, that has resurfaced. So have other pathologies. I mean, a number of people, we had a scare here. I mean this. Last week, suddenly there were drones, this new toy that the military have. there were some drones around the airports here in New York and New Jersey, particularly in New Jersey. The whole country began a speculation on the sort of, we all laugh, but it's a sign. And we have it all the time now. UFOs, flying saucer. Well, I mean, people are in trouble. Even the very hatred of the immigrant. It's preposterous. What? This desperate Mexican family with their little children, and they have nothing. They literally have the shirt on their body, are demonized. The president, an invasion. What? And then they're caught putting the children in cages because they have no place for them. I mean, and they're about to do it again. Let me give you another example. The normalization of what the Israelis are doing in Gaza. Right? This is not about the Israeli versus Palestinian struggle. I have my views, and if you're interested, I'd be glad to share. I'm talking about after last October, after the Hamas attack, what did the Israelis do in response? And I believe that deserves the name genocide. It's an unspeakable attack on a civilian population, violating every norm of war, Geneva Convention, any of the others. You're targeting hospitals and schools and churches. The excuse, there were Hamas activists in it, that the Geneva Convention doesn't have an exemption for that. Mm-hmm. You can't do that. You can't kill large numbers of people. For me, that's a sign. It's a sign, A, of something terribly wrong inside Israel, but that's over there. I'm talking about the American response, in which, thankfully, an amazingly large number of Americans see it for what it is, right, and are opposed to it. It's amazing. And I don't want to in any way take away from that. That's heroic. Right. But I'm more interested for the moment, analytically, in the decision by the Democrats and the Republicans and the leaders of most colleges and universities in the country to feel entitled to repress college students who are doing no violence, no nothing, who are standing in a little tent on the grass in the center of the university, holding signs or singing songs. I mean, it's unspeakable what is done. They would never do that if there were a civil rights march saying you must give equal housing or equal credit to black people or something. But they needed to endorse a genocide. Whoa. This is a qualitatively different thing. It doesn't take a genius to know anything that is done to others will eventually come home and be done by you to yourself, to your own people. The university is showing itself prepared to do that to its students, because it's prepared to do that, what is being done in Gaza also. So I think there's a level of disintegration in this society, which is what I would expect from a declining empire, because you have to be alive to the complicated ways in which an empire unevenly. So I would push at you. You can find areas that are not declining. Bank deposits can be going really good over here, or investment in the stock. Yes. And you have every right to bring them up and ask, how do you account for that? Of course. But I would argue that had you understood what I'm saying, you wouldn't be surprised to discover how uneven the decline is. What's going on here? I'm amazed at the support for Palestine in the United States.
Absolutely.
I mean, what's going on? Right. Somewhere, the declining empire is visible to my I'm still a professor. I teach. I'm about, next semester I'm teaching again at something called the New School. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
School of Social...
Yeah. So I'm a visiting...
One of those leftist...
it was.
Lefty type...
not anymore.
Really, okay.
Not anymore. They came down on their Palestinian students and faculty also. That's another thing. You're watching protections of people being ignored. Professors are discovering that tenure isn't what they thought it was. That's another sign. These institutional arrangements. Trump is a sign. Trump is a transgressor of boundary, of what is polite to say. He says what is impolite. He does it deliberately. He does it because it's his reputation by now. I get that. But it is acceptable. He gets convicted for raping a woman. And he's still the president. You have to come to terms with that. He has put it now into his cabinet people committed to destroy the cabinet position that they have been put to. The new head of the Department of Education is instructed by Trump to end the Department of Education.
Right. There is also Vivek Ramaswamy and others are appointed to dismantle to fire people and even dismantle whatever productive is left within the state.
Right.
As you were talking about the student protests and how that have informed both American audience and also to some extent the rest of the global South, although the rest of the global South didn't need that to be informed about the genocide. As an observer of American politics and history, I thought this was one of those rare moments within American history where its democracy actually deepened. Not the superficial democracy that we talk about all the time, but if one thinks about the New Deal years, how the laboring class was absorbed within the democratic framework and how people were actually enfranchised, then the civil rights movement, to some extent, the anti-Vietnam protests, and then there was a long kind of decline or silence in terms of the dismantling of the labor union movement. Even the universities have been very, very quiet in the last 30, 40 years. And this was, I felt like one of those moments where a lot of students and them being part of the gig working workforce, a lot of them would work part-time in cafe and so they understand, and all of them came together with the Amazon strikes and the Starbucks and all of that. But to stay for one more moment and ask a question, I think I completely understand and agree that one cannot look for a total collapse of empire at every node. And this is for those of our viewers who might follow Marxian dialogues may think about this Althusserian point of condensation, whether these are different crises but happening at different levels of time, or whether we are at a time when all of them have collapsed at a time when we can think about something of a reconstruct. I don't know whether that's barbarism or socialism, but I'm even not sure whether it's a point of condensation. So to be concrete, one can think about the collapse of the empire of cotton, Sven Becker's book, not to say that cotton has disappeared, but the cotton barons and how that used to influence politics and all of that was gone, and that was probably replaced by other empires of automobiles, empires of others. So I understand your very not sophisticated, very incisive, insightful argument that empires are collapsing and maybe like new empires are coming together. But these are also these are small little empires that we are discussing. And there are these grand empires, the empires of the IMFs and the World Banks, how austerity is blackmailed, how dole of money is offered to all those hundreds of countries facing sovereign debt crisis to say that if you don't cut down on your pension schemes or wages, we're not going to give you this important money. If not, you have to default and you are gone. And so that's one kind of empire, the hegemony of the dollar imposing sanctions. So that's the grand empire. So I understand your point that the small little empires, which are not insignificant, I'm not trying to diminish their importance by saying small little, but these are empires within a grand empire. So are you saying, if you're saying that these small little empires are collapsing and maybe new empires are bubbling up, that makes sense to me. But if you're also saying that the grand edifice, the grand empire where the center is the United States, the dollar empire, the IMF World Bank empire, if all of that is also collapsing, do you think that is also weakening the military empire? Whether you think that is also collapsing? And if that is collapsing, I think that's a good segue to also invite you to discuss what you have been wanting to do for a while. A lot of people are talking about China now. Even people interested in empires, theoreticians, intellectuals are talking about a future Chinese empire. So answer me about my first question and then take it down towards your understanding of where you see China going forward.
I like your invocation of Althusser. He's one of my teachers, so I like that. I think we're headed towards one of those condensation moments. I don't think we're there yet, but I think that the number and variety and levels of crisis are more intense than I anticipated. Certainly more intense than I saw up until the crash. People have asked me this, so I give this answer. The crash of 2008 and 9, global, was an enormous change. And for me, I would date the quantum leap, the break from the little crises one can say are normal in capitalism, within an industry, within an enterprise, within a sector, even within a whole country, now become qualitatively and quantitatively bigger. They are moving toward a possible condensation when a big break happens. I want to remind everyone, because I like telling the story, of a famous conversation brought to the attention of Lenin in Russia, supposedly by Trotsky and Stalin, who brought it to him. And they were moaning and groaning at some meeting, the revolution is taking so long. And his answer to them was, sometimes for decades, nothing happens. And then in a few weeks, decades happen. Okay. So we're not there yet, but on levels I had not foreseen, we see it moving in that direction now. And I could actually see it surprising us almost at any juncture now because of what has happened in the last 15 years, more or less. The special thing that I want to make sure to say, the reason you had that special moment of the mass American young people, and older ones too, but particularly young people, finding Israel's behavior in Gaza outrageous, or whatever word you want for it. There is an economic basis. I'm not taking away from the ideological dimensions of this, My students cannot get the jobs that my generation of professors assumed. I assumed if I stayed long enough and got my PhD that I might not get a job in the city I wanted or the university I wanted, but I would get a job being a professor if I wished. My students have no such assumption. They expect to put a livelihood together in which they get some income from this activity Mondays and Thursdays, and from this over there, they do that on Tuesdays, and on the weekends, they do and they do gig work or part-time. Unbelievable. And they don't expect that, for a couple of years before No. That's a vista that can last a whole lifetime, or part of it. But there is an disrooted, unrooted bitterness about all of this. Because as young people, they were led to expect what I was led to expect. But unlike me, they didn't get it. And they're all very aware that I teach 2 courses a semester and get paid 20 times what they get for doing the same thing. Mm-hmm. It's grotesque. Not only that, since I'm older, they're younger, they probably give more energy to their teaching than I do, having done it for, the outrage of it is, now, people may not say a thing about it, but I'm married to a psychotherapist, and I'm very aware of how that stuff can go in and sit there and come out like a medical doctor will tell you, if it hurts over here, the problem may be here. And part of the job of diagnosis is to show you that where it is not what it is, etc. So I think you're seeing a transformation of the job, a secure job with enough money. That's why we have no marriages. Nobody gets married anymore. What's the point? You can't live off each other. Everybody has to work, and the work is totally uncertain. Married, I don't know, then next week you get a job, in Chicago. Then what do we do? So, no children. These things are cumulatively producing a loneliness and an unrootedness that is part of the empathy with the Gazans. Is they feel, obviously bombs are not falling on them, and I don't mean to say that their suffering is comparable. It isn't. But there's a basis for identification. We're being destroyed. We're being destroyed. And what did we do? I worked hard. I studied hard. I got good grades. I did my homework. My parents said, this is good. You're good. And now I'm stuck here. I can't even take care of my parents. What am I? They're very bitter. There's a very bitter, and that feeds the anger. Mm. Let me tell you about an event. I'm sure you heard about it, but it's not getting the attention here, and that's a sign of fear. A young man from a good family with a good Ivy League education walked not very far from here, walked up behind a CEO and shot him to death. Crystal clear why. Because he's the head of a health insurance company. He was. And this kid has suffered, young man, I would guess, mid-20s, something like that, from an upper-class family in Baltimore, Maryland, a graduate, I believe, the University of Pennsylvania, Ivy League school. And so he writes on the shell of the bullet, the cartridge, deny, delay, defund, because that's what the insurance is.
Right.
When they don't cover your broken knee or your illness, which is how the guy became a millionaire.
I don't know if you have read the University of Chicago polling that they did. It was about 1,100 respondents, but quite diverse, representing different
Over the
parts.
whole country?
Over the whole country, asking for this particular event, and 66 to 70% of them said that our healthcare and the insurance sector, it's looting, and they didn't use the word looting, but profit and denying benefit coverage. That was 66 to 70%.
I've been reading other polls, but they get the same number. About 2/3 of the people expressed sympathy with what he did and why he did it. You get people who say, well, you're murderers and you shouldn't kill people, all that. But it is that. It's a pro forma. I'm not saying it isn't genuine. It's just they know that the big issue here, the issue of importance, is not the particular of what was done, but what the point of it is. And I can see it in young people, my students. I mean, if there were a call tomorrow for a demonstration here in downtown New York, just to show support for that young man, you'd need 1,000 cops to contain that movement. Wow. In the I live in Manhattan. I live in a tall building on the 9th floor. So I have to go in the elevator, to get to my apartment. So I'm sitting in the elevator. I'm listening to the conversations. There's 6 or 7 people in the elevator. And I've been listening. Nobody is against what happened. Right. All of these people are commenting to one another in sympathy because they've all had the experience. Anyway, that's frightening. Because I went to Yale and all that, I get documents from the Yale Center for whatever it's called, entrepreneurship. One of these grotesque things that Ivy League universities and others do. It's just a way of sucking money. You bring the executive, you put him in a nice hotel, you get a few professors to pretend that they care what he says. He says something, you send him home, and a check comes to help the university. So I read, they're having meetings at Yale of executives who are anxiously talking about beefing up their security. They know it's not limited to that man. They know it's not limited to that industry. What are they picking up on? Rage, hostility. And let me make it personal. I'm a critic of capitalism. I'm not interested in the individual acts of this or that capitalism. I'm a critic. I can't handle the invitations. I can't. They're everywhere. Churches, universities, labor unions, the media, all the time. And I'm just one person in the void talking. But the critique of the capitalism, people want to hear it. All right, China.
Can I make the question more specific?
Please.
So that, given I sympathize for the long hours you've been talking, there is a lot we can talk about the economic success of China, and I think it's worth discussing. So if you're interested, you can pluck a few points to share.
I'm not that much.
Yeah, but my interest here in asking you as a Marxist theorist, I recently interviewed Prabhat Patnaik from India, and I asked him about China, and he said that China's economic success in terms of growth and also ensuring development at the bare minimum, even though there are problems of inequality and stuff, is obviously no one can deny. But to what extent China is going towards socialism remains an open question. And he was critical about a lot of things within reform and opening. And this is something to think about, because if you visit China, there is almost a large popular consensus that during the years of reform and opening, China has made great progress. Of course, there are people on the left who are critical of some of those things, but there is a general consensus that we developed during the reform and opening. As a Marxist theorist, or someone who looks at theories of the left, I'm very curious about what your thoughts are on China vis-a-vis the whole socialist vision, the socialist utopia, socialist ideal. How much do you give China on that front?
Okay. China defines itself, at least the leadership does, as socialism with Chinese characteristics. They like that phrase. So let me pick up from that. I like that phrase too. Why do I like it? Not for the reasons that they do. I like it because it situates China within the dominant tradition of socialism that emerged from the 19th century, which, in my own opinion, is not a particularly Marxist definition. Here's what I mean. If China is socialism with Chinese characteristics, then it is a particular case of socialism. That's what they're saying. It's a particular kind of socialism. So what's the socialism that is the general, of which this is one kind? You know, that's how I'm trained to think. Okay, well, now I'm going to be very blunt and just in the interest of time. So Scandinavia and Western Europe clearly are socialisms. Well, it's where it was born, out of England and Europe, socialism in the 19th century. And what it has meant there has been what I would call capitalism, because I define that as the organization of production around the dichotomy between employer and employee, in the way that I would define feudalism as the organization of production around the lord and the serf, or slavery around the master and the slave. These are without those kinds of distinctions, but recent human history is particularly focused on master-slave, lord-serf, employer-employee, and their variations.
And by that you mean the relationship between them,
yes.
the rent, profit,
all of that. So but basically organizing production in that way, that there's a small group of people who are masters and a vast array of people who are slaves, a small group who are lords, I'm a European example, and a mass of people who are serfs, who are not slaves, but serfs, and then a small group of people who are employers, and a mass of people who are employees. I gave you that statistic. U.S. Census Bureau, 3% of Americans are employers, 97% are not. Okay. For me, that's capitalism. That's the uniqueness of capitalism. And what is European or Scandinavian socialism? It's when the government is assigned, collectively assigned, by the capitalists and the workers, emerging out of struggles between them. The government is assigned with the function of moderating, ameliorating, softening capitalism.
That's the post-war European.
Yeah, particularly. But it starts even with Bismarck in Germany in the 19th century. That's another conversation. But it's the government coming in and providing health insurance, or passing a minimum wage, or making sure that there aren't dangerous chemicals in the food, or a whole host of regulations, laws, all of that. That's one kind. Let's call it social democracy or democratic. I don't care. Look, it has gotten a variety of names. And then I want to distinguish it from Soviet socialism, Russia. Why? Because they did something different. There, the government went beyond regulating, but displaced the employers who were no longer private individuals, but the state replaced them. They didn't, but they could have called this socialism with Russian characteristics, or Soviet characteristics. Might have been better. Now, again, condensing a lot of material, but to be blunt, China is a hybrid of those first two. And so it qualifies as a distinct. It's neither Scandinavian nor Soviet. Why? Because it's roughly 50-50. It's remarkable. Half of it is sort of like Scandinavia, and half of it is sort of like the Soviet Union. And sitting on top of it is a state apparatus, and sitting on top of that is a Communist Party. And the Communist Party, this double layer of control and regulation, is quite effective in managing this hybrid. And what we have learned in the last 50 years is that this hybrid can grow faster than either of the parts. It is the hybrid of no contest, none. The Soviet Union was an extraordinarily successful growth story in the 20th century. But the Chinese have outdone them, and that has to be, it seems to me, straightforwardly admitted. But notice in the way I talk, and I don't want to offend people, for me, I understand that, and I accept that as a kind of socialism. They are in the tradition of, and I think that tradition attracts me because for the mass of people, it strikes me as a definitively demonstrated improvement in the quality of the lives those people are now able to live. Whether it be what they gave to Europeans in their thing, or what the Soviets gave to the Russian people in their thing, and what Mao and now Xi Jinping and have given to the Chinese people. If socialism means a better deal for the employee class within capitalism, they've delivered, which is why China's leadership is secure in its situation. In Russia and Scandinavia, there is the further problem that their lesser achievements were unfortunately combined with the targeted viciousness of the private capitalism, so they couldn't survive. They're gone in Russia. Putin is not that. And in Europe, they are on the defense and they're shrinking. France is, of course, France is the exception. But so where does that leave me? Well, I understand Marx's work to have been the critique of the employer-employee way of organizing production. Since that this was driven by capital, which in Marx's language, I shouldn't say this, but I will, which I read in German, because it's my first language, so I'm familiar with German. When he talks about Kapital, he uses words like Verhältnis. In German, that means relationship. He's interested in the relationship. And that relationship, it's like if you're interested in the relationship of marriage, well, then you have spouse one and spouse two, and they are linked by a set of activities that, okay, then Then there is employer, employee, and they are linked, and that's what he's interested in understanding. But he's not a neutral. He's crystal clear to me that he hates the relationship of employer to employee, seeing it as a root cause of social horror. Not the only cause, not the main cause, none of that. It's an important cause, and he is devoting his life to it, not because it's more important than other things, here comes Althusser, but because it gives you an angle of understanding that other people have repressed, mostly in themselves. So they don't think that, they don't ask about that way.
The alienation part.
Yes, in part. But it's also, I use metaphors. Unless you're an unusual person, you don't think a great deal. When you think about your mother and your father, you don't think about the sexual relationship. It's awkward. For all kinds of taboo reasons. I mean, there's nothing intrinsically awkward about it. But you do not, unless you're unusual, discuss with your mother what she and your father did that produced you, for example. Everybody knows, but, okay. So Marx, I think, if he were here, would say, everybody knows. You know when you go to work that employer wouldn't give you $20 an hour unless you know. You can't say it,
Right.
Not even to yourself. But if you're lucky, you sit in a room where a character like me says it with a smile, right? Then you can get it. Just like if a comedian starts making jokes about your parents' sex activity, you will laugh because you will recognize you knew that. You didn't say it, but you knew it. Anyway, so Marx, I believe, analyzes capitalism by focusing, I use the word entry point in my writings, but focusing on the relationship of employer to employee. And he does that as a critic because his goal is a revolutionary break from that relationship to a different one. And that different one, in my judgment, is if the employer-employee relationship disappears and is replaced by a community. I think that's why words like socialism and communism appeal to Marx, because he wants the workplace, wherever that is, could be in the home, could be at the store, could be in the factory, could be in the government, wherever it is, where people are working to produce something, good or a service, they do it as a collective. One person, one vote, a group of, like in a community where we all live, but we all vote for the mayor. If we have a mayor, you get a vote for the mayor, one, I get one, my neighbor gets one, and we have to work out an agreement. Or if we can't agree, how we decide between, and we do all that. And in the West, this is often called a worker cooperative. Doesn't have to be called that. It does have other names. It could be, you could mean, the word commune could mean that. All kinds of, I'm sure different cultures, because this is not a new idea. This is an old idea. So my guess is in all major cultures, yours, mine, anybody else's, it exists with whatever name and whatever nuance, but it exists. So for me, the question is, like Prabhat, it's an open question. On the one hand, you have a government that proclaims its loyalty to Marx, its Marxist quality, its Marxist commitments. And I take that serious. I take that seriously. On the other hand, they haven't done it. I understand that doing that is an immense act. I assume it'll be very difficult. I can understand hesitancy to do it if there are risks, as there surely are. So I'm left, like he is, saying it's an open question. I'm not going to condemn them because they haven't done it yet. Right. I think that's empty. What does that get you? But I'm not going to say, well, they've done it. That would be crazy too. They haven't done it. I'm open to being told that I shouldn't think about it this way, that there are other ways. Again, I'm sure that's true, and who knows? I'm not going to foreclose on it. But it seems to me they've done enough for the Chinese people. You know, my first introduction to the Chinese was when I was a high school student, and I was given a book, a novel, by an American, I believe she was American, Pearl Buck. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you ever heard of it. The book is called The Good Earth. It's a novel about China before, I don't know, China in the 1920s or 30s. And, I don't remember all that much, but the book had an enormous, because there were descriptions. I believe she was an American missionary who went to China to bring Christian, whatever it is, missionary spring, besides sexually transmitted diseases. The book was about poverty, and I learned about Chinese poverty. And it was well written. The book got prize. It wasn't, our teacher gave it to us because it was one of the good books you should give high school students. And all I could think of was the passages of mothers who could not sustain the babies and left them by the side of the road. And all of which I later learned was had that in Europe for centuries. I didn't know that then. But for me, it was an introduction. And once I understood what had happened since 1949 to China as a society, then there would be no way that I wouldn't be respectful of what had been accomplished there.
I have a follow-up on your analysis, or let's say your vision of how you think about your vision of socialism. And I think it's completely reasonable that anyone thinking about socialism would think about a workplace relationship where there is a democratic relationship among people involved in the production process, rather than a managerial relationship or even a feudal relationships and so on and so forth. I, however, think that is kind of partial to understand the economy as a whole, because one can have kind of relative democracy, let's say, within the workplace, and yet they can be situated within a larger economy where the precarity of markets exist, where the labor markets exist, where the capital markets exist freely. I'm not saying that socialism means...
No, we agree.
That capital markets cannot exist. We don't know, because as China says, that there can be a stock market which you can constantly intervene by your financial institutes forcingly buying massive amount of shares from any giant corporation, so it gets bigger. So we are tinkering in that. When it's not doing well, we are directing our banks to give massive amount of credits to stimulate that. So we can do all those things. My question, however, is to merely define socialism as a workplace relationships, or purely in terms of relations of production, is slightly inadequate. And why I strongly feel about it is a lot of Western Marxists analysis about the Soviet Union is very hostile, given what they think is that, we don't have this lively workplace democracy within the Soviets, within the industry, because ultimately there were party bosses who had slightly greater power, maybe even much greater power, even within the production process, without realizing the difficulty there is to break out of not just poverty, but break out of all the impediments to mobilize your factors of productions and so on. What would be the relationship between the power industry and the steel industry when you don't have an infinite reservoir of coal? This was one question that China was grappling with the 1970s because they were stuck with the Soviet model of concentrating resources in heavy industries, while they realized that there is not enough power. So you constantly impose limits on this industry and that, and you say you have to be producer for this industry where they are the consumer. So you bring in all sorts of regulations.
Sort of ad hoc.
Yeah, ad hoc. Sometimes you, and then, there can be price mechanisms. There may be like directed mechanisms, all those things. What I'm suggesting is that
it's not adequate.
A socialist project is massively complex. And just to conclude my question or my comments is,
so far I agree with everything.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little bit concerned about aspects of criticism of the Soviet Union. Not to say that I don't criticize the Soviet Union. Everyone should criticize everyone. But what worries me is the simplistic idea that, there is the party dictatorship, there is some kind of centralization, you can't do that.
That's not my critique of the Soviet Union.
And there is a fetishization of decentralization, bottom-up forces, and some of that is very, very American, given the whole libertarian tradition and all of that stuff. But when you rebuild a society that has been so impoverished and looted, and, I cannot but imagine that there has to be some centralization. There has to be some party dictatorship.
Yeah, I understand. First of all, just a correction on the United States, because I'm in America. The reason you get the constant babble in this country about decentralization, horizontalism, and all that is it's what's called in psychology a reaction formation. It's because we are so hierarchical that we must celebrate. We produce in every generation the yearning for the other, because Americans hate to go to the post office. Part of the hatred of the government is because you stand in line for a long time, and then a surly person who doesn't respect you or your issue treats you like shit, and you get your stamp for your letter, and everybody's left with a feeling that the government, it's that experience. It's when you go to the army, you get treated the way you do. When you go into your big corporation, you're an anonymous nothing. Right. You check in your hours of work. What? You're treated like nothing. Right. So people ask you, what's better than that? You want to hear a good story that's not going to give you that. That's the negation of all of that. That's what and it's childish only because, not that the instinct isn't good, I celebrate.
Right, yeah.
It's just often childish because it doesn't ask, why is it so? What is it? Because when people are asked, well, why do you think it's like this? Their answer is greed, or power seeks to have more power. These little syllogisms, they're not an analysis, they're a slogan. And these are smart people. So what? It's so urgent to be the negation of that, that you get this. It isn't a considered critique. Will you have people who criticize the Soviet Union on the grounds that you said you were democratic, but you weren't really? That person says that about almost everything. And that keeps them free of having to have any loyalty, have any participation, because every group, these are the people who join the Communist Party or the Socialist Party or the you name it party, and within 6 months they are gone because it wasn't democratic. I mean, this is now old and boring, and had nothing to do with what I'm about. Why do I focus on the organization of production? Well, one answer is that's what I got from Marx. And what I got from Marx was this is a part of the story that the culture we live in, a capitalist culture, renders taboo. It's unthinkable. I forget who it was.
Also invisible sometimes.
It's either that goes with it.
Right.
You can't think it because you can't see it. You can't see it because you can't think it. Somebody said, I forget who it was, it's more difficult to tell people in a speech what it might be like to have no capitalism than it is to tell them not to have a climate. They can get the idea of a climate, but to think you can do without capitalism, they can't. So
Marx has this beautiful line. I can't recall exactly about the necessity to start with the production process. He says a dreary process of something, you have to focus on the production.
Yeah. Well, but what I took from Marx, and look, I'm aware that you and I can read the same book and we can come away with a very different understanding. It's not that one of them is right and the other one wrong. That's wrong. What's correct is to understand you are a different person from me, and this experience of reading this text will, of course, blend with your brain differently. You didn't have my mother. You didn't have my father. I didn't know your cousin who was important in your life, blah, blah, blah. So what I get from Marx is that this is a taboo, and it's invisible. It's unthinkable. Even people who are social critics that I had learned from observe the taboo without knowing that they're observing the taboo. And I'm going to break the taboo. I am going to say, no, this. Not because it's the only thing. Not because it's the most important thing. No. In my classes, just to give you, at this point in a lecture, I would stop and I would lean across the podium and I would say to my students, how people dance is every bit as important as what goes on in production. Do you eat with a knife and fork, or do you eat with your hands, or do you eat with chopsticks, or these things affect your diet, your health, what the meal means, how you interact with the other people at the meal.
Write poetry looking at the moon, where Elon Musk now wants us to send us to go there.
He goes first.
Yeah, he goes first, and a handful of them.
With not enough fuel to come back.
And we shouldn't write poetry about love and romance looking at the moon, because we have to constantly think about it as a potential place to be colonized, as if we have ended colonialism here.
Yes, and his buddy has now told us, I shouldn't digress, but his buddy has now told us, because you have to appreciate this, in the age of anti-colonialism, which has peaked, in a way, the Israelis are being condemned all over the world because this is settler colonialism all over again, as if the British in India or all the other examples are not there, which have few. In this world, Mr. Netanyahu is leading an effort at settler colonialism of the worst kind, the one that wipes out millions, of the kind that colonized the United States and so forth.
Ilan Pape says that Israel is an 18th or 19th century settler colonialism on
in the wrong time.
21st century.
Yes, which is why it's doomed, in this moment, the genius of Mr. Trump is, before he takes office, which is still 3 weeks away, he's going to take Panama, Canada, Mexico, and Greenland. What? And but it's beautiful. It's what's said, the wisdom of the child. The comment, the 5-year-old doesn't have the filters. So the 5-year-old sees and, it's extraordinary. Anyway, so why do I focus on production? because other people don't. It's not that I think that that'll solve all the problems. Not at all. So, for example, you know the theory of overdetermination I get from Althusser and others. The macro is no more or less important than the micro. What goes on inside the workplace is not more important in shaping the society than what goes on in the region or the locality or the political structure or the government, if there is one. That's what overdetermination means. There is no essence. When I teach it, or I try to teach it to my students, I used to use the example, suppose I ask you all as students to write a short essay in which you work out the best way to capture elephants in the Berkshire Mountains in Massachusetts. One of you would have enough courage to raise your hand and say, I cannot write such an essay because there are no elephants in the Berkshires. And therefore, why are we being asked to develop a strategy for something that isn't there? Okay. I said that for me, asking me to find the essential, the elephants, I don't do that. I'm not going to do that. That's crazy, that stuff. You know, don't ask me to do that. That's not what I do. If I had more time, I would also explain to you that that's not possible. That you, as a critic of me or as a different thinker, you're going to talk to me about China. You are also going to focus on certain things and not others. And then I'm going to come at you and say, oh, excuse me, you're claiming that's the essential. No, you will defend yourself. I'm not. I hope you are. It's not the essential. I have an easier time with you if you said, that's the essential. Then I could have fun with you. But I would expect you to say to me what I've just said, which is, we all have to do, we can't explain everything. For me, that's a recognition of the limits of human beings. I cannot jump over that building. I can practice for years. I can become an excellent runner and an excellent jumper. I'm not going to get over that building. I'm not. And you know something? I don't care. And if you say to me, you're never going to explain exactly what happened in China, you're right. I'm going to tell a story. And in my story, I'm going to focus on this and this. And you're going to ask me, why do you focus on that?
Right.
And the answer is, because I see that it matters and other people are afraid. And that's enough. That's enough. And when I'm done, you can say to me, very interesting story, but it misses certain things. You're right. But that sentence is always true about any story anyone ever wrote about it or spoke about it, because that's a limit. I can't jump over the building. I can't give you the explanation that handles it all. And if I could, you'd be very depressed, because what would then be left for you?
Right. Well, Professor Wolff, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. It seems like a never-ending discussion, but I'm so thankful
it doesn't end.
that we did it.
Yes. My teacher, Louis Althusser, used to end one summer in Paris. I spent working with him a little bit, and he used to end our meetings by saying, la discussion n'arrête jamais, which means the discussion never stops.
On that Althusserian note, Professor Wolff, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have 2 requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.